Again, I do want to thank you. My name is Scott Trees, and I'm here today to share with you an interesting journey that's based upon a lifetime association with horses. My involvement in the equestrian world has been at a variety of levels, but in the last 4 decades, I have spent the majority of my career chronicling the horses as both a photographer and a filmmaker. My assignments have taken me all over the world, allowing me to meet a lot of interesting horses and people too. And this in turn has allowed me the opportunity to observe, experience, participate, and photograph a variety of horses in geographical locations and meet a lot of different people as well and cultures. Observe is my key word because when I'm shooting, I become more of an observer as opposed to a participant. Now, part of the problem is I have an ADD brain and the pinball association that goes with it. So when I put a camera up to my eye, I'm focused, no pun intended. But it's the typical camera up to the eye, I'm focused. Camera comes down, pinball brain. Camera back up to the eye, I'm focused. So when I am able to get focused, it fosters a state of mind that allows me to take in the scene that's in front of me. Now, and it's supposed to be black right now, so you've not lost picture. I grew up wanting to be a doctor, and at that time, when I was looking at college, there was little consideration of how the body was impacted by the mind, and so I became a vet major until one day I realized that I could put a person to sleep easier than I could a dog. And so I went ahead, and because I've been fascinated with the workings of the mind, I changed my major to psychology, and I put an emphasis on how thought influences behavior and also on nonverbal communication. And at that time, I had no idea how that decision was going to serve me well in future years. And I picked up a camera when I was in college for the first time, and I figured out when I did that that's what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to take pictures. And so after graduation and armed with my degree in psychology, I started my journey and began to figure out a way to reach my goal as a photographer. I had no business classes, I had no formal training as a photographer, and so it was jump in, learn how to swim, and learn how to swim fast. But my degree in studies did come in handy, and because, you see, I believe that the subconscious mind is amenable to control by suggestion. And I'm going to say that again. I believe the subconscious mind is amenable to control by suggestion. It's like a neural computer pathway and acts upon the last command it receives. I'm going to be a successful photographer. Enter. Okay. I'm no good and I'm not going to succeed. Enter. Okay. And of course, we've always got the yeah buts, that I'm going to succeed, but I don't have any money. Enter. Okay. No money. So I had to work hard to direct my thought and followed by action into the kind of life that I wanted. And learning to control those thoughts took a lot of practice and discipline. Now understand, I am an artist. And the route that I took was not necessarily on a straight line. And more often than not, excuse me, it was a very interesting journey akin to entering a maze. I knew that I had the strength and determination to get through it. But I also knew that once I came out the other end, I would somehow be changed because of the experience. And I've always said that if I had any size at all, I would have made a great NFL quarterback because I'm a hell of a scrambler. But I was able to build a successful, very successful business quickly and very young. But being young, arrogant, and stupid, I had no idea that it would not always be that way. Lesson learned. The thinking this way came into importance for me in 1994, when I was diagnosed with prostate cancer at the age of 44. And at that age, it's extremely rare and usually fatal, so my initial prognosis was not particularly encouraging. And after getting over that shock of diagnosis, the one thing I had to control quickly was fear in its many manifestations. And I was a few days departure away from a 6-week assignment in Europe. And when the oncologist looked me square in the eye and said, "Scott, you have cancer and you've got a very aggressive tumor." And for a few seconds after that, all I heard was blah, 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 while my mind tried to burst with the possibilities of what was going on. And this trip was really important for me because I was still dealing with the consequences of an emotional and financially costly divorce. And this was going to be a profitable trip that I needed. Now, my pocketbook wasn't the first of my thoughts upon diagnosis, but the subject of finance definitely reared its ugly head along with all the others and finally started screaming louder than the rest of them. Now, my surgeon suggested that there was a shot that might slow my symptoms down for the 6 weeks that I wanted to go to Europe, and I was giving it serious consideration. And then I walked across the street and met my internist and friend, and he let me rattle on for a while, and then he looked me straight in the eye and he said, "Well, Scott, your choice is 6 weeks of work or 40 years of life." And it hit me right square between the eyes. And I knew that, if I had gone to Europe, it would have killed me because my tumor was that aggressive. But I also mentioned that I had to deal with my fear, which is something I know that everybody in this room and out there has had to deal with at one time or another. And not necessarily the adrenaline rush of imminent danger, but more that fear of a mind run amok with possibilities. And in my case, the possibilities is that I was going to die a lot sooner than I was planning on. Now, I've meditated off and on in my life, and there's a place that I go in my mind that's my tranquil and healing place. And in that part of my subconscious, I started to garden, and I planted a seed, which was my tree of life. The soil was rich and fertile, well-nourished, and when I planted that seed, I said, I'm going to beat this cancer and live. Enter, okay. And as the tree began to grow in that special garden, I visualized my negative thoughts as fears and weeds in my mind's eye. And I'd see myself pulling them. And some of them were big, nasty buggers, and I'd have to pull them out, and then I'd pull them out again, and some days I'd keep pulling that same weed all day long. But it got to the point when I kept pulling, and eventually there were a lot fewer of them. And I also used a mental trick that was taught to me by a very wise old Cherokee medicine man that I met in my association with horses. And he taught me to say after a thought that I didn't want to manifest, to say the word cancel. And so by suggesting that word, I could say to my subconscious mind that I could modify the energy to stop that thought from taking form. The cancer is spreading. Cancel. Enter. Okay. And yes, obviously I believe that the mind can influence the health of the body. Now, I must have looked somewhat deranged walking around during that time going, cancel, 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 cancel. And today, of course, I could do that with my headset on the cell phone down by my waist, and everybody'd think I was talking to somebody else beside myself. But I got to tell you that those 3 weeks prior to my surgery were probably some of the most difficult and cleansing times of my life. And things that I thought that I dealt with, but it actually just shoved back into the back of my emotional closet, reared their ugly heads and looked me straight in the eye and said, I'm back. Now what are you going to do with me? And what I did was let it go. And I also gave up my membership in the Church of Perpetual Guilt. And I survived a very difficult time in life, but it was also the best thing that ever happened to me as I look back on it, because at one point in my life, I was the most important person I knew. And the humbling experience of surviving cancer has been a great gift in my lifetime since my surgery date of August 11th, 1994, when I had a radical prostatectomy. Certainly that experience helped to shape my life, shape my life, and I consider it one of the better things that ever happened to me, and it set the stage for how I lived my life from that point on, and certainly carried into my career. Now, one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, why horses? Well, a part of that reason is that I come from generations of horse people, and so an affinity for horses was in my DNA. And as I mentioned, my interest in photography started in college, and pretty soon I started a business photographing fraternity and sorority parties, and I made a killing. Part of it was from going to my fraternity brothers saying, hey dude, how much will you pay me for not showing this picture to your girlfriend? And that helped pay for my education. I also did a lot of sports. I worked for the college newspaper. I shot portraits. I really enjoyed shooting architecture. But I did anything I could do to take pictures at all. And so it was during this time that my mom came up and said to me, how about photographing some of my horses? And who's going to say no to their mom? So I developed a knack for it, and it opened the door and realized that that was going to open a door for me that I could make my livelihood as a photographer. And it's not that I was passionate about horses, where they were my entire being of life. I'm not. Certainly I like and I understand them well, but rather I was passionate about photography. And photographing horses provided the engine of the train for me, which allowed me to travel the world to create and capture my images. And it wasn't just horses. I did a lot of commercial work as well. And essentially, I became an advertising photographer. It just so happened that the main subject that I was photographing had 4 legs and nickered. Okay, now my goal as a photographer has always been to take the ordinary and make it extraordinary. And I've tried to do that with my life as well. But I try and take things that people see every day and maybe show it to them in a way that they haven't seen it before. And I didn't realize at the time that I was doing this, that when all of this started, that I was going to be learning from this association with horses. And fortunately, as I look back, those lessons started early in my career. And one of the first opportunities that I had, and it was an international assignment I got, to go to communist Russia in 1983. Now understand, I grew up in an era duck and cover, which I know some people in this room understand, but it was the Great Red Menace, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War. A mutual and assured destruction was the political undercurrent of the era. And certainly this wasn't my first time for foreign travel, but I have to admit it was with some degree of trepidation that I boarded a plane from New York to Moscow. I was shooting as a guest of the government, and because during that time a Russian-bred Arabian was highly sought after as breeding stock in the Americas and in Europe. And so in my first day in Moscow, and looking out of the window of my hotel room facing Red Square, I was struck by the fact that there was nothing familiar upon my arrival in the country. Architecture, cars, clothing, commercial goods, it was all quite different and foreign to what I was used to seeing as an American. And for me in my life, it was my Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore moment. Now the state stud was located 1,500 miles south of Moscow in the Caucasus Mountains in a village called Tursk. My arrival at Tursk Stud that first morning was greeted by this scene as I pulled into a farm, which was a horse-drawn wagon carrying morning grain to the barns, and that grain had been loaded by hand. And I was soon to notice that there was very little mechanical assistance for the labor on the farm. And for me, this is when the definition of horsepower began to take on an entirely new dimension. And it was here that I was to witness for the first time how horses help mankind survive, and on a daily basis. Now, it's important to understand that during that time in communist Russia, privilege was accorded not by the kind of job you had, and not necessarily your income level. And for example, in that era, athletes were at the pinnacle of the pyramid peak, and as such, they had access to the best housing, food, and clothing. In other words, things that I took for granted in this country were a right. Now, these gentlemen that rode herd every night also had a very important job. Mares and foals were turned out at night in the pastures around Tursk, and there were no fences. So they rode with the horses, and they were there to guard them against predators and poachers. And since, as I said, the Russians were selling a lot of expensive horses to the European market, this important job accorded them a whole lot more privilege and access to better goods. But when it came to interacting with the village inhabitants, I certainly couldn't speak Russian. And the people of the small village of Tursk did not see many non-Russian people to begin with, and certainly didn't speak English. But it was here that I was to learn one of my important lessons when it came to visiting other countries. And that is that taking the time to learn how to say hello, please, and thank you in their language with a smile could go a long way. Now, I did have a Russian interpreter that looked like a Slavic version of Elvis, but I was to learn that I did have a common language with the people that worked there, and that common language was horses. Now, in people, body language is 55% of the conversation, 37% is voice, and words only comprise 7%. For horses, and most all of the animals really, body language is even more of a factor, approximately 90%, with the other 10% being the sounds that they might make, like a growl or a coo. And the effort at nonverbal communication that we establish with each other as Americans, not as Americans or not as Russians, but as people, opened a common ground. And with that common ground open, it also opened the door to build an element of trust. And theirs was certainly a life much harder than mine. For example, the young girl that you see pouring water did so by hauling up water from in a bucket from the one well on the farm, pouring it into the other buckets, and by hand carrying that water every morning to 100 stalls. And this would be the first of many times in my travels that I'd understand a basic premise, and that is that the majority of people in the world, regardless of race, religion, or color, share a common ground. And that's a basic desire to have consistent shelter, abundant food, resources, safety for their family, and the time to enjoy that. Now, I had come to this part of the world full of assumptions about a people that I had heard all of my life didn't like me. And so prior to my departure from the United States, I assumed this would be the case for the people that I encountered. But I learned from this experience that assumptions have a way of shaping incorrect thought, and at a lot of levels. And here was a very simple example for me. Now notice the lady in the red with the babushka. I brought along a Sony Walkman, and the lady in that babushka did not know what it was. She'd never seen one, and yet here I'd made a simple, yet oh so wrong assumption that she knew what it was, because they're commonplace where I lived. So I noticed her curiosity and placed the headphones on her ears. The tape that was playing was the soundtrack from the movie Flashdance, and Irene Carrera was singing "Oh, What a Feeling." And her daughter came over, and soon they were both listening, and it was the first Western music that they'd ever heard. And of course, I gave them the Walkman and all the tapes that I had with me. Now, another great experience came for me 10 years later as I was to visit a newly democratized Poland. I was to photograph two historical and legendary breeding farms, Michałów Stud and Janów Podlaski. And this is the farm where the latter, Janów Podlaski, is the farm where General Patton rescued a large herd of Arabians, and prior to his arrival, the grooms, which were military, had hidden them in the forest from the Nazi soldiers so they wouldn't kill them and eat them. And the people that worked here, some of them older men, had been caring for these horses during the war era, and they were obviously very proud of their association with these horses. And the handling of these horses was done as it had been for generations of horses and handlers. In large open barns, the mares would be tied at night, and the foals were allowed to roam free. And then in the mornings, they would all be fed and groomed, and they'd be taken out to a common paddock area where they would get their only source of water, which was a long spring-fed trough. And then they'd roll and mingle, slowly becoming restless for what they knew was coming. And what would happen is they would open the gates out to the pastures, and all these horses would run out there at a dead run to be grazing for the day. And this process had been repeated for generations of these horses. Now, once again, as I had done in Russia, I endeavored to get out amongst the village people and to kind of get a feeling for the people. Like I said, I got out amongst the village people, and I realized as I was amongst these folks how much of my life took for granted. And that fellow on the right there with the rabbits was one of the soldiers that actually moved the horses during World War II. So when I was out in the town square of Janov, understand that this horse and cart were this man's only mean of transportation. This was his truck, Cadillac, and SUV all rolled into one. And here was a much simpler life, certainly by American comparisons, but there was also this permeating sense of contentment and joy that I didn't anticipate. And there was also a willingness to allow me into their lives, even if briefly. We'll wait for our next slide. Yes, walking through the village one late afternoon, I came upon this fellow working outside his barn. And he was so flattered that I wanted to take his picture, and as a result, via sign language, I was invited into his home. So I walked into the kitchen with a dirt floor and a wood stove, and we had tea with water heated on that stove, and I shared tea and biscuits with he and his wife. Now, we had a great conversation with one another and didn't understand a word each other said, but we understood body language, and I think both of us that day put our best foot forward for our country. And I was later to realize that that for him was a huge extravagance to give me biscuits with tea, because that's something that they might open and celebrate with once a year. One of the things that's happened in my life because of horses is that I've been able to witness a variety of lifestyles and circumstances of horses and people, both good and bad. Now, in the world population of horses today, only about 10% live in good conditions, and by that I mean regular food, vet care, and shelter. And many of the world's horses live in dire conditions and are beasts of burden, and not because of cruelty or indifference, although that is the case in some situations, but because it's the best that the people can do that own them. Now, I witnessed this fact not all that long ago in Cairo, Egypt, one of the great historical centers of development of mankind. And in this part of the world, horses are still critical for the survival of a segment of an extremely poor population that depend on them. And it's not uncommon throughout the city to see horses and their owners working extremely hard and living in extremely difficult circumstances. We as Americans are spoiled in many ways, and I use the term spoiled here in regards to the fact that there's so many things that we take for granted and consider a right that for much of the world is a privilege, and that's starting with our freedom. And this feeling actually began with my trip to Russia, but one of the major lessons in my life because of horses has been to gain a much better understanding of a right versus a privilege. And this has become a significant component in shaping my life's philosophy. Now, an unfortunate fate for children in some parts of the world even today is maiming them in some fashion so they can beg for a living. And I was walking outside Cairo University when this man, pulling himself on his homemade belly rollerboard, was begging. And the sidewalk was full of students, and he was largely being ignored. And I didn't want to get right in his face and take a picture, so I shot this picture with the camera hanging down by my waist and just pushed the button. And then after I took that picture, I bent over and gave him what would have been in his currency the equivalent of $20. And he immediately started crying and smashing the money against his head and screaming, "Shokran, shokran, shokran," which in Arabic is thank you, over and over and over again. Because for that man, he won the lotto that day. And one of the things that I'll never forget from this experience was the tears or the sound of him crying and still thanking me as he pulled himself along on this homemade cart, dragging his crippled legs behind him. It was really a very moving moment for me. Now, driving down the back streets of Cairo later that afternoon, I saw this young lady leading her water buffalo down the street. And I couldn't help but wonder if she felt that she was entitled to a cell phone, designer jeans, fancy tennis shoes, as many of the youth in my country expect. But the one thing and throughout the world and everywhere I would travel, and in spite of what I would consider dire circumstances, I'd find that the spirit of the children somehow managed to overcome their surroundings, at least for a little while. And as with all cultures, the future of any society rests upon the shoulders of their children and the experiences that shaped them into their adulthood. And they're facing a much different world than I did growing up into adulthood. With ever-increasing global competition for jobs, U.S. students are going to be competing against ladies like these that speak several languages, go to college, have a lot less lofty expectations of their worth out of college, and generally have a better work ethic than American students. But I'm not here to talk politics tonight, and I don't have the questions to these or the answers to these questions. And trust me, if I did, I'd be way too expensive to talk to. Now, as I have aged and reflected back on and looking at some of my experiences in life, there are a few key elements that seem to stand out from the rest. If you take the time to communicate with horses and try to understand them at their level, interesting things can happen. Much of the nonverbal language of horses and people really starts with eye contact. And from there, the demeanor and posture of the body carries into your communication. Now, that first eye contact is extremely important. Most people don't realize that the horse is the only domesticated animal that can look at a human being eye to eye on an equal height basis, standing normally. And because of that, I think that horses are able to make a different sort of connection to people than other domesticated animals. Along with the eyes is the position of the ears. And when combined with body movement, they can display anger, contentment, fear, or curiosity. And the nonverbal aspect of body language is eloquent if you take the time to learn it. And I have found that horses will take time to communicate with you if you bother to learn their language. And guess what? I found it works with people too. And the latter portion of that statement is the most important. Try to listen. And I have to say that as a result of my association with horses, I've definitely become a better listener. Now, as you can no doubt tell on the image on the right, this horse was not happy. And we just finished taking the shot on the left when the mare that was there lunged for the other mares and all hell broke loose. So a lesson I learned early in life about horses is they're unpredictable. And no matter what I might plan for what I wanted or needed them to do for my image, I knew that most likely they might not do it. And so I had to take that awareness and consider all the contingencies for the shooting plan that I put together and be ready to change if necessary to get the shot that I wanted. And this lesson has also carried over into my life because life can be very unpredictable at times. And I learned that I had to be flexible. I had to be willing to modify my approach when necessary to get the results that I wanted. Now, one of the things that happens when I photograph horses is I'm disrupting schedules. They're creatures of habit. They don't have a clue why I'm disrupting their schedule for a photograph, and for that reason, I had to learn to be patient. And while horses express body language, they also read body language. So if I get uptight, horses are going to get uptight. And I'm not going to get that expression that I need in the response that I seek. And interestingly enough, again, that same premise holds true with people. My body language and attitude can have a lot to do with how people respond to me. Just ask my wife. Now, have you ever been driven by maybe a pasture full of horses and seen horses relaxing and with the warm sun of the bodies? Well, one of the things that I like about most animals, including horses, is that they have the ability to live in the now. Now, I don't know about all of you out there, but that's not so easy for me. And over the years, I've tried to focus more on living in the present moment but the combinations of the needs of maintaining a self-employed business combined with an ADD brain can make that a challenge. But it's something that I try and do on a regular basis because truly the present moment is the only thing that we have any kind of control over. And as I said, at one point in my life, I really was the most important person I knew. And after my grandfather had a stroke, I purchased a home for my grandparents next to mine. But I was so busy being busy with self-importance that I failed to take full advantage of the fact that there was a great man living next door to me. And then one day he was gone. And I was full of guilt and remorse. And not too long after that, my little business empire came crashing down around my ears. I got divorced, I had cancer, and I was beating up on myself pretty good. And to tell you the truth, excuse me, I didn't like myself very much. And I mentioned earlier with the onset of cancer and all the buried emotions that came back that I had to learn to forgive myself and stop looking back at the mistakes that I knew I'd made, which had been plentiful. It's a given. You're going to screw up. What is important is that you learn from experience. And the only people I know that don't make mistakes are the ones that aren't trying. And can you imagine if this horse was looking at himself and saying, "Oh, I can't believe you did that. What a terrible horse you are. You are so stupid. Nobody's going to want to stand next to you. You're awful." It just doesn't happen. And so the other thing for me is that, in all honesty, my ride in life has not been all that easy, but it's sure been interesting. And I've been thrown out of the saddle more times than I care to think about. But the thing that I learned is that I had to get back up myself, get in the saddle, and keep that ride moving forward in the direction that I was trying to go, or depending upon the nature of the fall, it might be a slightly modified plan. But I could not look back at what had happened. I don't drive my car backward to get where I'm going, and I can't live my life that way either. Excuse me. In the herds of the wild, the most precious members of the herd are the foals and the elder mares. And they're kept in the center of the herd for protection. The most expendable are the young bachelors, and they're kept on the outer perimeter of the herd. Now, in this country, we have put such an emphasis on youth, when a significant demographic of the population is over 50 and growing. And the fact is, you live your life longer as an older person than you do a younger person. And I can attest to the fact that aging's not for sissies, and yet I certainly wouldn't want to be young in mind again. And there is something magical for me about seeing and experiencing the grace, beauty, and wisdom of a beautiful and older broodmare. Now, observing these broodmares with their foals at various stages, I've learned that some lessons on how they nurture and protect their progeny. Now, that sounds obvious to anyone that's a parent, but if you watch mares interacting with their foals in a herd, you'll notice that after a certain age, they get after them for bad behavior. She's not a friend, she's a parent. And as such, she's a teacher and a guide to interacting with the world. And these lessons are critical to that survival of the foal. And by so doing, she also teaches the notion of choice and consequence. The notion of choice and consequence. And there comes a point that when that foal falls down for doing something stupid, that the mare certainly takes notice, but she allows the foal to get back up on its own 2 feet. Now, I think a lot of well-meaning parents today are not willing to let their children fall, let alone get up, and facing consequences for bad choice is a part of that process, excuse me. And some of that well-meaning intention comes from the fact that most of us are going to spend a lot of energy dealing with unnecessary fears. And many times those fears are based upon assumption and not fact. And taking the time to make certain we have the facts before jumping to conclusions can save a lot of frustration and avoid creating unnecessary fears. Horses are cautious, and as prey animals, they're fight or flight animals. But if they ran at everything in the wild that grabbed their attention, they'd never stop running. Now, I shared with you earlier that many of the world's horses live in terrible conditions, as do many of the people that own them. But the one thing that I would notice about all of them is that they handled these situations with a quiet inner dignity. They endured. I don't think horses consider themselves victims. The same can't be said of a lot of people. And again, it boils down to the concept of choice and consequence. It concerns me today that many people in our country today seem to be looking for somebody to blame for their life and their circumstance in life. And as a result, they deflect accepting responsibility. And we all get so wrapped up in the day-to-day aspects of life that we forget to take joy in the simple things in life. It doesn't take long to enjoy a moment. In a workshop that I give called The Art of Seeing Light, one of the things that I teach my students to do is to take light walks. And this is something I still do myself and on a regular basis, and I find that it brings me back into the present, looking at how light illuminates form and taking joy in what I observe. Even if it's just for 10 minutes, it can be refreshing. Because as you get older, you realize that it all goes by way too fast. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago that I was a young stallion full of confidence, ready to take on the world. And now as an older, somewhat beat-up warhorse, I can look back and know that it's not been an easy ride, but it has not been an easy ride, but it sure has been a great journey. And the good Lord willing, there's going to be more to come. Enter. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, that was great, Scott.
Thank you.